Tonight we're talking about a critical issue for our country and, in fact, for many countries around the world, but one particularly acute in our country. The U.S. educational system, quite simply, is in a crisis. It's been in a crisis for a long time. For too many of our students, we are failing to provide the critical foundation that they need to succeed in the world. That failure is particularly acute when we talk about communities that are traditionally disadvantaged. Such a failure in equality in something as fundamental as education is simply unforgivable in our country. It's in conflict with our core values, what we think about providing an equal opportunity for every young person in our country. It also conflicts deeply with this American notion that the American dream delivers opportunity for people who are willing to work hard and who have merit. If the educational system creates inequality from the beginning, that inequality will go through our entire society. I believe the university can play a role through its research and, of course, through the education of future leaders around our country in trying to remedy this problem. But I don't think it's going to be easy. I think this is a very difficult problem. I'm fond of quoting John Gardner, a former Stanford professor and the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, who once said, "What we have before us are some breathtaking opportunities disguised as insoluble problems." And this is an extremely difficult problem, but one that we have to tackle for the future of our young people. Tonight, we're going to take a look both at the nature of the problem and what we might do as a nation to try to correct it. Why is the achievement gap so big? What role do poverty and race play in sustaining that gap and increasing it? And how do we address this as a country? We have three distinguished leaders with us tonight. Linda Darling-Hammond, professor and founder of the Stanford Center for Opportunity, Policy, and Education, and also a great contributor in the area of teacher education as well. Salman Khan, global teacher, entrepreneur, teacher to people around the world through the work of the Khan Academy, and a real innovator in using technology as a way to improve educational opportunity. And Reardon, professor of poverty and inequality in the School of Education. Each of them brings a different perspective, and we'll try to bring those experiences, that knowledge, to bear today. So Sean, why don't we start with you? How do you describe the landscape? How big a problem are we really facing here in terms of educational opportunity?
Well, I think you have to think about two big dimensions of inequality in American education that have both a long history and a kind of recent history. And one is the history of race in America and the history of race in particular in relationship to American education. We made some progress on racial issues, particularly in the 60s after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the Civil Rights Movement, and a set of laws that were passed at that time that made real progress. We haven't made any significant progress on racial inequality in education really in the last 40 or so years. So we have a lot of unfinished business in the context of racial inequality. We also have growing inequality in terms of social class. So income inequality in the United States has risen dramatically since the late 1970s. It's higher than it's ever been at any time in the last century. And those two forces combined, the racial inequality and the socioeconomic inequality, combine in kids' lives and in families' lives to create really segregated communities and therefore really segregated schools. And so poor children and minority children often are not just growing up in poor families, but they're growing up in really poor communities and they're attending schools with lots of other poor children. It's very hard to create lots of high-quality schools at scale in conditions of concentrated poverty. And so the confluence of race, class, and segregation creates a sort of crisis for poor and minority students in the United States.
Linda, you've done a lot of work in this area. What do you see as the key problems? What are we missing here? What are the foundations going on here? Well, and I think you have a slide on this topic.
I have a slide, yes. So if somebody will call up my slide, it will give us just a little way of conceptualizing the inequality, which builds on what Sean just said, that we have tremendous inequality in income in the country, and growing segregation. Many of the policies in the 60s and 70s that were in place, the war on poverty, following that, desegregation assistance, were eliminated in the 1980s and have not been brought back. So we are living with that. But then on top of that, and of course we've got growing childhood poverty. So in the United States, about 25% of children are low income, way above any other industrialized country in the world. We're neck and neck with Mexico, but not anywhere close to the countries in Europe or Asia. In California, about 60% of kids are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So that just gives you a sense of how deep it is. Twice as many kids are homeless today as were homeless 10 years ago. You could fill every stadium in the country on NFL Sundays with homeless children. That's how many we have. So you take that, but then you layer on the fact that our funding system for schools is inequitable, and typically we spend more money in schools that serve more wealthy and affluent children. So there are public schools where you find multiple swimming pools and fields and computers on every desk and all of that, and then others where the buildings are falling down and there aren't textbooks and the basics are not there, and those are correlated with race and class. So we layer on that second layer of inequality that is associated with inequitable salaries and working conditions. So if you want to go teach in Oakland, you'll earn about $10,000 less as a beginning teacher than if you taught somewhere else in the 5-mile radius. And you'll have bigger class sizes because they have less resources to spend. So then you get inequitably distributed teachers. That is associated with an inequitable curriculum. There are schools where you cannot get a college prep curriculum because it's not offered. And then you get dysfunctional schools on top of that. So we have to unpack all of that to really deal with the equity issues.
So Linda, let me just ask about the school funding issue. It would seem, given that we know that children who come from poorer backgrounds actually begin kindergarten and first grade at a disadvantaged level, and that makes sense given the environment they're in, shouldn't we be spending more money in the poorest districts, not less?
Yes.
It seems like it makes absolute sense.
Well, and yes, absolutely. And the good news in California is that after years and years and years of starving the schools and starving especially schools serving low-income students and students of color, we passed in 2011 the most progressive school funding scheme in the country, which allocates money based on pupil need. So you get more money for each student based on poverty, English learner status, and foster care status. And if a district serves a concentration of those kids, they get an additional amount of money. It's not yet all the way phased in. We're just on that path. But if we stay on that path and reboot Proposition 30 so we have revenue, we will actually be doing what we should be doing, which is what most industrialized countries in the world do, which is put the money where you need it to serve the kids and be sure they get the...
I mean, we probably stabbed ourselves in the foot several times, or shot ourselves in the foot several times with the combination of Proposition 13 and the reliance on property tax, which then, of course, created this situation that wealthy neighborhoods had more money for their schools. And it probably was never a smart policy decision from the beginning.
I would agree with that also.
Undoing it, though, is a very difficult...
But we're on the path to do it. And, there are a few other states that have done that. Massachusetts did that years ago and so on. So there is some hope.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot of political will.
Yeah, it does. Sal, talk about, maybe you could start by talking something about the inspiration for creating the Khan Academy, and then we can talk about how you see that, how technology might play a role going forward to deal with some of the challenges we have.
Yeah, and I'm assuming a few people are somewhat familiar with how all of this started. My background was originally in tech, but about 12 years ago I found myself as an analyst at a hedge fund. And one of my cousins, who was 12 at the time, needed help. And I offered to remotely tutor her. She was in New Orleans, I was in Boston at the time. I started working with her. She was actually having trouble with unit conversion, but she eventually got that, got caught up with her class, and she was actually being placed into a slower math class because of that. And then once she got caught up, this was only kind of a 5-6 week intervention on my part on the phone, I became what I call a tiger cousin. I called up her school and I said, I really think Nadia Rahman should retake that placement exam. And they said, who are you? I said, I'm her cousin. But they let her, and that same Nadia who was being placed in a remedial math class was now placed in an advanced math class. And it was just a small intervention. So I started working with her younger brothers as their tutor. Then, frankly, word got around the family that free tutoring was going on. And I found myself working with 10, 15 cousins, family, friends all over the country after work. I had a day job. And, one thing led to another. And I saw just a common pattern in all of my cousins, whether they considered themselves strong students or weak students, that they had gaps in their knowledge, that they were kind of being promoted, they had shaky foundations. And so I started, just for a hobby, I started writing software for them so they could get practice problems. And I could, as their tutor, see what they were doing. And then when we engage, I'd have more information. And one of my friends, and that was the first Khan Academy, that the domain name was available, so I called it that. And it was a few, actually it was 2006, November 2006. By this point I had moved out here. And a friend, all my friends knew I had this crazy project with my family, and I was showing off the software at a dinner party, and one of my friends said, well, this is all cool, but how are you scaling up your actual lessons? And I said, oh, you're right, it's really hard now, just the logistics are hard, sometimes, I feel like I'm repeating myself, sometimes I feel like my cousins are embarrassed to admit what they may or may not need reviewing, and so he suggested, why don't you record some of your lessons as videos and put them up on YouTube. I immediately said, no, YouTube is for cats playing piano. It is not for serious math. But I went home, got over the idea that it wasn't my idea, and I gave it a shot. And simple. I put those videos out there. I started telling my cousins, hey, watch these at your own time and pace, and then we can get on the phone to dig a little bit deeper. And they said they really liked it. And maybe even more importantly, random people out there on the internet started using it. And at first those comments were just simple thank yous, and even that I thought was a pretty big deal. I don't know how much time y'all spend on YouTube. Most of the comments are not thank you. They're good.
Most of the YouTube videos don't deserve a thank you.
Well, maybe that's it. Yes, people get their better selves don't necessarily. But then I started getting letters from people saying, hey, this is how I passed algebra class. This is what got me through this. And so that's when that was the first aha that there was something there, and I started putting a lot more and more time into it.
So how much of this do you think is simply that video is such an approachable media for young people? I suppose they could go read this out of a textbook, but obviously the Khan Academy videos have generated a lot more interest than sending them to textbooks.
Yeah, it's some of it. It's not a new idea. When radio came out, people said, oh, this will solve we can put the best lecturers on radio and we'll solve the education problem. And when, TV came out, okay, we just have to see the teachers. And, then the VCR comes out. Now it can be on demand. And even on YouTube, I definitely wasn't this wasn't a new idea. I think there was something about the time, the technology, the access. I think it was a blessing that I was doing it as a bit of a passion project for my family versus, I was a big publisher putting millions of dollars. So when people watch those early videos, and even the videos today, it feels like somebody trying to work with their cousins.
It's not high production value.
No, yes, I take no offense on, yes, that is true. But I think that it does get to the essence of it. People have said it feels a little bit more like you're sitting at the kitchen table with someone, a little bit more. Because of its I tried to connect the dots the same way that it's in my mind. I saw that a lot with my cousins. They were good students, but they didn't see the connections between the different concepts. I tried to make that. YouTube enforced this 10-minute limit on me in the early days, which was great. And now we realize that maybe even closer to 3 or 4 minutes, if you can, is even a better time frame. And you just make it comprehensive, and it just allows a lot of students who, I think we've all felt it, where you're sitting we've all kind of hit a wall in some class or another. For some it might be algebra, for some it might be biochemistry, for some it might be quantum physics, but at some point you're like, I don't quite get what's happening here. And partially you might not understand that concept, but it's more likely to be some fundamental concepts. Your algebra wasn't that strong, or your introductory biology wasn't that strong. And so this gave students a very non-judgmental way to go back and review. And obviously since then we've been doing much more than just video. But the idea is a lot of students, some of them just need help immediately, and there's a lot of need for that. And then some are trying to reach longer goals, and this is the easiest way for them to access that.
So total number of views of Khan Academy videos?
Oh, total video views?
Yeah.
I think it's approaching 900 million right now.
900
Something
million.
like that.
It's pretty good.
It's a lot of students.
That's a lot of math.
That's a lot. Well, much more than math now.
I
But
know,
yes,
I
yes,
know.
yes. It's about
So,
60%.
Sean and Linda, you both touched on this issue of poverty. And Linda, you mentioned, I mean, one of the issues is the U.S. has much higher poverty. I think if you, as I recall, somebody did a study of global data and showed poor children underperform everywhere compared to children that come from wealthier backgrounds. But the U.S. is saddled with a much larger poverty rate among young people. What do we bring to bear on that problem? How do we attack the problem in the educational context? Because I think if we have to wait till we fix the poverty problem, it's going to take a very long time to.
Depends on who we get as president.
I guess that's probably.
But we. I mean,
You'd have to change Congress at the same time.
This is true. This is true. So yeah, we do have to attack that problem. But yeah, there are things you can do in the educational context, and one of the things we can do is. It's a combination, and Sean already mentioned this, of housing policies as well as others. You know, having this concentration is part of the problem. Interesting thing, we often look at the international rankings on PISA, the international test. And the U.S. is, 20-something in math, in science and reading, and 30-something in math, and so on. But if you look at schools that have fewer than 10% of kids in poverty, we're number 1 in the world in reading. And even if you look at schools with 25% of kids in poverty, we're number 3 in the world in reading. So, and that's kind of, that's way more poverty than the countries that we would be competing with.
So our kids from high wealth families are doing
or that are in schools with relatively smaller proportions of poverty. What you have is when you get to 75% of kids in poverty in a school, we have a growing number of schools with that very concentrated poverty. That's where you see the huge drop off, and then the average comes down even though the top may be higher. So, but the educational responses need to take into account what kids need to be able to learn, as well as structure the learning so that it's productive for them. So community schools and models of wraparound services can be very helpful, where kids are getting the food they need to be, able to learn without being hungry. Healthcare, the number of kids with just vision and dental problems, it's about 30% of kids who don't have the glasses they need to see. It's comparable in the dental area, and to the point where some kids, we've got tales of kids dying of cavities that just couldn't see a dentist. So getting the health care wraparounds, being sure that there are supports for children and families when they run into social problems is a part of it. And when we do that, we've seen this in a lot of schools, and you put productive instruction in place, then you get much, much better outcomes. The part of the instruction too that matters, of course, you need highly skilled teachers. And in fact, you need even more skilled teachers in contexts where kids are coming with a wide range of languages, experiences, backgrounds, learning needs, and you need to scaffold. You need a lot of tools. Saul has helped on the tool front. So we need to have a framework within which we're recruiting great teachers, preparing them to teach diverse kids well. I think we do that at Stanford. I think there are other places that do that. And then making it possible for them to go into the communities where they're needed. We need in this country a policy that most high-achieving countries have. If you will teach, we will pay for your education. Period, end. That's what they do in Finland, Singapore, Korea. You could go down the list. And then be sure that they get a good preparation so that they can do the job that every teacher wants to do. Nobody goes into teaching saying, oh, gee, I really want to fail the kids.
No.
And
I hope not, anyway.
they're not there for the money.
They're not there for the money, so.
And so, giving those tools, and it's a lot you need to know
Yeah.
to be able to be an excellent teacher.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, I want to come back to that in a second, but before I do that, Sean, I want you to share some of the new data you have that talks about this correlation between poverty and achievement.
Yeah,
I
so
think he's got
I
a
think we
slide
have
on
a
this topic.
slide like Linda.
There we go.
So this is not the Andromeda Galaxy. What I and some colleagues and some of my graduate students have been doing for the last few years is collecting test score data from every single public school in the United States. So about 215 million test scores from the last 5 years, and looking to see how academic achievement and achievement gaps look in every single school district in the United States, and then trying to understand what kind of places are kids being more successful than others, and what are the factors of that? Is it the schools? Is it the communities? Is it preschool? Things like that. And so this picture, this study is going to get released on Friday, so you get a little sneak preview of it. This on the sort of horizontal axis here is a measure of a community's socioeconomic conditions. So high poverty school districts, communities would be on the far left for you. I'm directionally challenged. And affluent, wealthy places would be on the far right. And then on the vertical axis is a measure of the average test scores of students in every school district in the country, measured on a kind of common scale everywhere. And so the most striking and obvious thing you see there is that there is a very strong correlation, about 0.85, for those of you who like to know what the number is, a really strong correlation between the socioeconomic conditions in a community and the academic performance of students by the time they get to middle school. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is not a measure of the quality of the local public schools. That is, the test scores of children by the time they get to middle school are the sum total of all the kind of opportunities they've had to learn by the time they get there. And so that's opportunities in their families, whether they have a cousin who can Skype and tutor math with them, but also preschool opportunities, the quality of childcare, after-school opportunities, and the quality of the public schools. So this is not a measure of school quality, it's a measure of sort of opportunity in local communities. And you can see it's really, really unevenly distributed across America. In fact, the lowest performing school districts there are more than 4 grade levels behind the highest performing school districts in the country. So that's a huge difference. But there is some good news here. My graduate students tease me because they say I'm like the bad news guy. I'm always telling them what's wrong in the world. So there's some, I think, not some good news, but some opportunity to learn from this. And that is, even though there's a strong correlation, there are school districts, there are communities with the same levels of poverty, relatively poor places, that are doing much better than others, where kids have better opportunities and are learning more, and it's showing up in their test scores by the time they get to middle school. So we need to sort of identify those places and think about, learn about what are the things that make those places particularly better places to learn than other places like them. That's not to say we can solve it just by sort of place-based policies. I mean, there really are nowhere with lots and lots of poor kids where we have figured out how to solve this problem at scale. And so if you think there must be some break-the-mold sort of school district out there that has getting sort of Palo Alto level results in sort of Newark-style conditions, there is no such place. And we don't know how to do that. And it's not clear there is a way to do that. I think we really need to think hard about the concentration of poverty in the United States.
But could I just talk about your second slide that's not coming?
Yes. So Linda has a addendum.
Well, I've seen slides before, and there's another one which sort of shows the distribution of school districts in many different places, but he does one with Massachusetts and California. And almost all the Massachusetts districts are above the line, and almost all the California districts, after 30 years of starving the schools, are below the line. And so state policy is what matters in education for the most part. States are the agent of change. And there are also policies that affect healthcare availability and preschool availability and a whole lot of other things. So I think one way to understand this is to start looking at, and we did this in some earlier studies, states that are doing much better, and say, well, what are they doing? Not that they can break the mold in the way you just described it. They can do much better if kids have some of the other things that they need and the schools are better supported.
Now, but I think, Linda, it's true that you can even find districts that spend similar amounts of money that have widely different results, though, as well, right? I mean, Massachusetts does pretty well, but I think some other states that spend about the same amount have much wider variation in terms of results. Isn't that? Do you know why that's true? I mean, that could be equity among the districts within the state, even though they're averages.
Yeah, I mean, averages don't tell you much because
Right.
in some states, the high-spending districts are spending 4 times as much as the low-spending districts and so on. And money is not everything, but, there is a modicum that matters, and there's some very interesting recent studies by Carabo Jackson and Rucker Johnson, which show that in places where they made investments in school finance reforms to equalize the funding, low-income kids who got 20% more spent on them over the course of their 12 years of education than they would have. Get graduation rates 20 percentage points higher, close the poverty gap as adults. So money well spent can make a difference. You can spend money badly, and Washington, D.C. is the classic case that often gets trotted out because it's very high spending and gets very poor results, but I think that's partly what happens when Congress tries to run the schools. So
Probably. Saul, I'm interested in what, given the points that Linda made about the shortage of qualified teachers and how I think that's not a problem we're going to solve overnight. That's going to be a long problem.
You could solve that problem in 3 years. They did that in New York City. I'll tell you how after Saul answers your question.
Okay. New York City did. They made a lot of progress. They paid a lot of money, but they did make some progress in solving it. But Saul, what role do you think technology could play in amplifying and supporting teachers and bringing other ways of learning to the classroom?
Yeah, well, on Linda's pyramid that she had there, we're starting to hit on a couple of those layers. There's access to curricula. Our mission is free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And when we think about that, the world-class is an important part of our mission statement. We want to be good enough or the best so that a school district that could afford anything would still choose to use Khan Academy as a primary or a significant resource. And but a school that has very little would also choose to use it. And a lot of what Linda talked about in terms of students coming in at all sorts of different levels, how does one teacher cater to 20, 30 different students at different levels, that's where technology could be really valuable. Things like the idea of personalized education isn't a new idea. In ed schools, people talk about differentiated instruction. Every student has different levels, but if you go more than 200 years ago, the few people who got education got pretty personalized education, but it was a very small segment. But as soon as you had mass education, it couldn't be that personalized. But one thing that computers are good at is, okay, well, let's see where you are, and let's see if we can give you something different or move people at different rates and give information to the teacher to empower them. Another thing is, a lot of people associate us as students use it, but a lot of teachers use us,
right.
Either as a tool in the classroom or even for themselves to upskill their own, whatever it might be, math or science. And once again, that's really key because there's no judgment. They can do it in any way that it fits in their life. We did there was a group of Stanford students who last year offered to do kind of a consulting project for us. And we said, yeah, we want to start measuring impact. And why don't you do a survey at Stanford and some other peer universities and just ask the question, has Khan Academy had a meaningful impact on your education? Assuming that it might have happened, it might have helped the student in middle school or high school. And we were hoping that 5–10% might say yes. We got 60% said yes to the survey. And what was really interesting is amongst first generation, the students who were the first in their family to go to college at Stanford, 64% said yes. And then the context they gave were, this was the tutor that my family couldn't afford. I had access to much more rigorous curriculum. We got comments, my school didn't offer AP whatever.
Right.
And so I was able to self-study this and then take the APs. So those are places we're hoping to address. One of the things that I'm super excited about in the very near term is we have this partnership with the College Board around the SAT. And at first it was like, okay, there's going to be a new SAT. They reached out to us, can you be the prep for that? And we said, yeah, that'll be great. And we all wanted to make it about real learning, about real college readiness. And so that by itself, we said, okay, that could help level the playing field. We'll see. We don't have any delusions that it'll solve all the problems tomorrow. But what's been really exciting is the PSAT, which 80% of American students take. In the past, it was just kind of this test that we took, and for most students, it was just like, oh yeah, you got some practice, and maybe if you're in the top 5%, they might say, oh, you're national merit something or another. But now, and this was effective the last PSAT testing, any student who took it can go to Khan Academy, type in a code. If they give permission, it acts as a diagnostic for personalized learning. And so the software can tell what are you strong or weak at in reading, writing, or arithmetic, and immediately start doing weak point training. And then we can start to see the impact on the SAT. And the reason why that's especially exciting is, the College Board has, I think this is, they've shared this publicly, is they see on the PSAT, you look at even by 10th grade, you look at a underrepresented minority, has the exact same PSAT score as a whiter Asian student. They have the exact same score in 10th grade. And then they follow that student to the SAT, and then something happens. There's a divergence just over those 2 years. And there's theories as to why that happens. It could be expectations, it could be lack of rigor, who knows what it might be. And then actually even the students who still achieve still have a much lower rate of applying to selective universities, even if they are in the top 10% of SAT takers. So what's interesting here is we can start interacting with the students earlier, and we could say, okay, you did really well on the PSAT, or you did whatever you did on the PSAT. Why don't you engage on something like Khan Academy, and in conjunction with, it could be a Boys and Girls Club or an after-school program at your school. Human beings are really important in this to make sure students get engaged. But then we can track these students, and we can incent them with scholarships or some type of community, and then we can start to see if we can start to move the dial. And there's going to be a PSAT 8 coming out, and so we might be able to start identifying these students even earlier.
Well, that's great, because I think one of the other things it could help with is, you may be aware, but children from low-income backgrounds, even with high achievement scores, basically don't apply to elite schools. And they don't apply because I think the threshold looks too high. They think, I'll never get the financial aid, I'll never get whatever else I need. Or, I'm going to go to the school that's 25 miles from home, even when they belong at a really great place. And this is an area where we could use technology like this to intervene and try and encourage those students to find the place where they could really succeed well and would benefit them the most, I think. So, Linda, you talked about the teacher problem. That's a piece of the problem, but one we really need to solve, particularly in districts that are underserved and are really challenging. How do you think putting money in is one way to do it? Paying teachers better? Teacher training? What do you think is what are the silver bullets or the solutions here?
Well, let's just take shortages. And I mentioned New York City, but I could give you several examples, including Connecticut, San Diego, and others. 1988, Connecticut had severe teacher shortages. In New Haven, where I went to school in the 70s, I could teach without a bachelor's degree in the New Haven schools because the shortages were so severe. And that had been going on for a long time, and the cities were always understaffed. 1988, they had a commission. They did a whole makeover, extreme makeover, raised the salaries to the top in the country, raised the standards for teacher education, so teachers learn more about reading and special education and a whole lot of other things, made it more rigorous, and so on. Within 3 years, they had solved the teacher shortages and had moved into a surplus state, which they stayed in for many years thereafter, had raised the standards so that most teachers were coming from the selective colleges in the state, did a whole lot of other professional development and so on. And over that decade, they went from, sort of in the top third of states in the country to number one in every content area on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And the analyses said it was mostly driven by that substantial ramping up of teacher quality and attractiveness. So I think it could be done in New York City. For years, they were always hiring late. You couldn't even get through the hiring system at 110 Livingston Street. It was just a disaster. You'd show up and they'd leave you standing in the hall and whatever. The salaries were low. Lots of shame and blame, lots of embarrassment of the schools, and a court case which said you got to raise the salaries to be comparable. Literally, within 1 year, they went from 50% of the new hires being underprepared to 90% being fully prepared. And then over the next couple of years, they kind of closed that gap just by, and they also moved hiring up and started to treat teachers like people who were, needed and applying for an important job.
Right.
Now, they've backtracked, but over and over again, we've seen that dysfunctional practices can be turned around. And this is not an area where it would take, decades to simply, pay teachers what they're worth, raise the standards so you get good teachers for those salaries. And by the way, when people are better prepared, they stay in longer.
Surely.
So then you have less of the turnover.
I mean, could we ever aspire to be a country like Finland or Iceland where teachers are paid comparable to other professions and treated like professionals? I mean, we have this
we are
strange
the richest
problem.
frigging country
I know.
in the world.
I know.
What?
And
why can't we do this?
And for a critically important job. I mean, teacher is a critically important job, and we can't.
I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And of course, there are some states that do that. And so if you go to teach in Massachusetts or Connecticut, a few other places like that, which also tend to be the higher achieving states, you will be paid pretty much comparably to other college graduates. If you go to teach in Texas or, some other places, Louisiana, you'll be paid way, way at the bottom. And the shortages track that pretty well.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Sean, this data that you showed, do you have any insights of what besides poverty are the key factors? I mean, you mentioned a few districts that do well even though they have high poverty children.
Right.
Do you have any?
Yeah, so I mean, we're doing a lot of ongoing work to dig into that, but some places really sort of stand out. So Union City, New Jersey, stands out as a big outlier in our data. And it turns out David Kerp wrote a book about Union City. They're doing really good work there. They've invested a lot in preschool. They really expanded and built a big, effective bilingual instruction program. They have a large Latino population, and they really invested in bilingual education. So, and they spent us a lot of energy focusing on kind of the small stuff, the quality of teaching, making sure that things ran efficiently and people were in classrooms and there weren't sort of lost kids without teachers. And, they sort of just did the hard, slow work of building a good school system. And they invested in a few key things like bilingual education and public preschool, and it really paid off. They show up in our data as sort of well above where you'd predict given their poverty rates. So it's possible, I think, to do some of this stuff. It's not sort of glamorous. The solutions don't sound glamorous, but all the studies of the effectiveness of, say, investing in high-quality preschool for poor kids show it's an investment any hedge fund, Wall Street person would want to make. Right. It pays off like 7 to 1. I would take that investment, right? You would too. Why don't we do that as a country?
Yeah, so why don't we do that?
It's a political
I think
will
the data
issue,
actually shows that investing in preschool is repaid in income taxes that individual will pay by a factor of 5 or so.
Yeah.
So why don't we do this? It seems like easy. And the mayor in New York City has struggled to do it even at a moderate scale, I think.
And they're actually getting really strong, early results,
right.
Which you just see in, kids not being identified for special education and, just being able to start kindergarten with the vocabulary gap, reduced and things like that. So it is, it's an obvious one.
Yeah, it is an obvious one.
Political will. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, so we have to go talk to those guys about how to create political will. But when we know the answer, when it's a good investment, when all the economists tell you they would do it, then it's like a good investment, right? When it just sort of makes common sense, why not make sure kids get to school as ready to learn as possible rather than try to have the K-12 system fix a problem that didn't need to be there in the first place? It makes an enormous amount of sense from sort of every angle you look at it, except we don't do it at the scale we're capable of doing it.
When I was in Finland, I helped lead a congressional delegation to Finland, and we went to meet with people in the Congress, and the 2 people who were the heads of the 2 houses of the Congress met with us, and they described this amazing system. And then somebody asked the question, well, how did you get all that done? Because they have an amazing preschool system and parental leave and, all kinds of supports. And these 2 women who were representing the 2 houses of Congress said that Finland has a law which requires proportional representation of women in the legislature. And they said the women did it. That's another strategy.
Something to be said for that. So, so if we think about this issue of inequality and the school system not actually closing the gap, but actually possibly making it larger.
Yeah.
It seems it's such a crucial problem. You would want to solve it, and yet it doesn't get talked about on the national press very much. I mean, certainly your paper will be coming out; it'll get some attention, but despite that and the growing inequality issues that I think most Americans are concerned about, it begins in school. Yeah. And so why isn't it a topic of more conversation? Is it simply because the people that have the money don't want to talk about it, or are there other issues you think?
It's interesting. It's not a big topic in this presidential
in the
race.
election.
And, it's frequently not been.
There are a lot of topics that are important that are not being discussed in the current president.
We could make a very long list if we chose to do so. You know, I don't know why it is that we are so, there are, where it's been talked about, where people have worked on it, it's because you've had very strong leadership. So I think about Governor Jim Hunt in North Carolina, who had two-term, you know, stints as governor. And in fact, in the 1990s, North Carolina, more than any other state, closed the achievement gap between black and white students, and was, you know, studied and written up as a result of that. And it was just because he was on it, you know, as they say, like white on rice for these terms. And they did all of the things we've talked about. They put in place, you know, Smart Start and preschool, and they raised teacher salaries, and they improved teacher education, and they put in place new principal training programs so that you would have good leaders for the schools, and, you know, all of the things that you could think of to help kids come to school ready to learn and schools ready to receive them. They became the first southern state to break the glass ceiling and become part of the top, you know, half of the achieving states. And there are other states that have made real progress. New Jersey is another one. Cut the achievement gap in half, and Union City had the good sense to do the right things with the new money when they put equity money into the system. So you need both. You need the kind of thinking about what to do with the resources, and then in New Jersey it was Christy Todd Whitman, Republican governor, who finally bit the bullet and put the money in that the lawsuits had been asking for to equalize school funding. It's a local issue, though. It's very much a state issue, and maybe that's why we don't see a lot of national leadership. It wasn't since Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was really the president who did the most for education.
Right.
I was marching against the war, so that's all I knew about him at the time.
We all were.
Right. But later I realized that, you know,
he was good on domestic policy.
he was very good on
failing
education
great on
policy.
foreign policy,
Yeah, right.
but on domestic
But
policy.
he, you know, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Education for All
Medicare.
Handicapped Children Act, and he was a high school teacher, trained at
That's
Southwest
right.
Texas
That's
Teachers
right.
College, had taught on the border. Most of his students were American or Mexican, right on a border town. And when he signed bills, he talked about the kids that he had taught, that he was signing these bills for. So maybe we need a teacher to run for president. I'm not sure.
I don't think we have any right now, but we could use one. We could use one, right? So, Sean, when you look at this data, as you said, your students called you Mr. Depressing or something to that effect. Do you see a glimmer of hope, or do you see something that we really could do? I mean, I think it's good to have some optimism about how we could solve the problem.
Yeah, I think there are things we can do. I mean, one thing I just think having good information and good data can help us be strategic about how to invest, learn about what things work. And, you know, I think all of us who sort of do research believe that knowledge is going to make the world better in some way. And so I am hopeful in that sense, right? That the more we know about the problem and the dimensions of the problem and the root causes and the possible solutions, the better off we're going to be. I also think there actually is a lot more focus on inequality in the last 5 years than at any time in the last 30, probably. And so we are in an era where maybe because inequality has gotten so big that it's sort of hard to avoid. But also I think there has been a lot of attention, particularly to economic inequality and to kind of racial inequality in social life, right? Mm-hmm. And those conversations are sometimes hard to have as a nation and as a community, but I think they're good for us and will help us get somewhere, right? So I'm hopeful about that. I also think, you know, there are a lot of solutions, and if you're sort of thinking, what can I do? There's a lot of things you could do, right? I mean, I think thinking about how we can improve schools through things like better preschool and better teachers and more funding and those kind of traditional routes is one approach. Thinking about kind of personalized learning and how we could really harness the powerful technology that is a lot better than radios, it turns out, right? So I think the new technology, people sometimes say, oh, there's always a technological fad that's going to solve schools, and it never does. Maybe that's true, but maybe the power of the computer can really be really useful in some ways, in ways that things like radios and broadcast lessons on TV really weren't, right? So if that's your thing, go do it. Like, right? I mean, it can't hurt. It's probably going to help, and we could learn about how to make it help. So, housing policy, vote for people who are going to care about these issues. I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and it can be easy to feel like, oh, we've had this problem for like ever, right? But that doesn't mean we don't actually know a lot of things and have good ideas about how to fix it.
And maybe in an increasingly global world, we realize that this problem is holding our people back a lot more than it used to in an earlier time, and that's a key issue.
And I think that you hear that in the global arena. The
Yeah.
OECD, publishes all these
Right.
studies about performance and so on, and one of the things they're tracking is that the countries that are moving ahead in terms of their tested achievement are the ones that are equalizing access. And so I think that there's a greater appreciation that it's not excellence versus equity. You can't get to excellence without equity.
Right.
And that's a new understanding.
New understanding. So one of the interesting things I remember one of my colleagues in the ed school talking about was that one of the characteristics of really great teachers was they understood what students were doing wrong, why they didn't understand a concept. How do you think the technology could evolve to play that role? It's almost the diagnostic role, the adaptive role. I mean, you can think about maybe machine learning, or do you think we can actually get there with technology that'll help with that problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're getting more and more data all of the time. Although, almost every day someone on our team says, hey, okay, I have this data science project where we can adapt the questions. And we already do some of that. But it's interesting that right now there's so many low-hanging fruit in terms of just making the content available and giving people agency and making it in a way that students feel like they can digest it and it doesn't judge them in some way, and that they can progress at their own pace and they can get feedback. But yeah, I think as you move on, for sure, you can start to see. I mean, right now we're probably running 20 experiments. I mean, in the tech world they call them A/B tests, where you take 5% of the population and you give them a slightly different experience, and we see how does that affect engagement, how does that affect kind of the assessments that are on Khan Academy. We're already starting an efficacy pilot on the SAT where we can start to see which students did what to lead to different changes in score performance. So it's very early days, but I have that optimism. There's a lot of big structural things, and just as a parent, I think my vote would be for the early preschool as well.
Right.
Probably 10 years ago, before I had kids, when someone said that, I was a little bit like, okay, I don't know, early, what happens in preschool? But just, I have a 7-year-old, a 4.5-year-old, and a 18-month-old, and just having seen what they were able to do by the ages of 4 or 5, and it was pretty much due to their preschool, it kind of blows my mind that there's a large segment of children who aren't getting that. But then above and beyond that, I think there's a lot we can do. The access question is already moving quite well, where in most of the middle income world, a student who is ready to pull the knowledge at least can access it now. And we have some issues with access and internet and all of that. We're going to get there with the developing world. And then I think the issue is how do we motivate students? And that's where I think the teachers, the best teachers we've seen, and there's over 1 million using Khan Academy in some ways, are the ones that form real personal connections with students and really kind of get into their head about who they are as people. And a lot of what we talk about is, can we liberate the classroom so you don't have to give lecture to everyone at the same pace anymore, so that you don't have to, the teacher doesn't have to spend all their time grading papers or administering things. They can spend most of the time with those one-to-one connections. And I hope over the next few years we can show evidence that how powerful that is.
Well, I think that's what we really should be using the teachers for, not the repetitive work that I think we could automate in the process. So one of the things that I think may be an inhibitor around political will is that I suspect many Americans will point to the failed experiments to improve schools, even though more money was, the Washington, D.C. example, more money was invested, and yet the results are the same as they were before. Can we think about a way of ensuring and making a deal with the American taxpayer? You give us more money, we will guarantee somehow that these schools, guarantee, quote unquote, that these schools will get better. Is that a deal we could cut? I'm interested in what you think, Linda or Sean or Salman.
Well, part of the question there is how do you educate policymakers to allocate funds for the right purposes in the right ways? And also, how do you grow up a cadre of very, very skilled leaders, superintendents, principals? And so we completely ignore leadership in this country in terms of the education system, in terms of investments. You know, we talk a lot about
government too.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mean, that's part of it, is because you want people who are enlightened and thoughtful about, okay, you know, when this money comes in, how am I going to really improve the experiences that kids have, you know, and put the right kind of tools in the hands of teachers, the right kind of skills, et cetera. And we do very, very little about that, and I think that is a big part of where we have seen real progress in some of the states that I mentioned and so on. It's been because they've really thought about not only that they're going to raise more money, but where they're going to spend it, how they're going to spend it, and how they're going to train up the leaders to make, you know, good decisions about that. And Kansas City is another place where you could point to for bad uses of money. Lots of money went in because of a court case. They built buildings and swimming pools and all kinds of things, but did nothing about supporting the learning process for kids, right? And so, you know.
They have a lot of good swimmers.
Yeah.
So one of the, related to that, which you may want to comment on, Sean, is this, a long-term trend in the U.S., which has been a shift of taxpayer investment from people under 18 to people over 65. And the numbers are absolutely stunning. The amount we're spending per person over 65 from tax revenue. We used to be spending a lot more for people under 18. Now we spend 3 times as much for somebody over 65 as we spend for somebody under 18. And from your perspective, is this the kind of investment we should be making? How do we turn that number around or get some balance in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when you know, poverty among the elderly was really, really high.
It was. And it was sad. It was really sad.
And we found the political will to figure out how to invest in Social Security and Medicare and things that really, and social insurance and stuff that really lowers the poverty rate, so you have a relatively low proportion of elderly people who are poor. So that suggests, putting on my optimistic hat, that we should be able to do the same thing for childhood poverty, right? And so that it's not a matter of sort of not knowing how to sort of change how we shift investments, but it's a matter of figuring out how to craft the political coalition that supports that. And, you know, kids don't get to vote.
And people over 65 vote in the highest percentages.
Right. And so there is a kind of imbalance in the democratic system when, you know, I think parents should get to vote once for every kid, plus for themselves, right? They represent more people, right?
Great idea.
I mean,
well, the votes get weighed by the number of kids in the district, of course. That does get counted, right? Because you vote on the basis of votes are weighted by census counts. So
in some sense,
in some sense.
But I mean, the other place where some of the resources can come from as we're beginning to take a hard look at incarceration and bring those incarceration rates down. We have been a state, for example, that has been spending for a period of time more on incarceration than public higher education.
I know.
We had a quadrupling of the number of people in prison. We're spending $50,000 or more for young men and women who we wouldn't spend $10,000 on a few years earlier to get them successful in school.
Get them a good education so they
So
get their job.
I think that's finally on the table, and that's part of the strategy is to, you know, make those investments where they can do good. There's a great commercial I saw once in one community in Southern California, which was a community that had become populated primarily by seniors, had become much more diverse. They had a little shot of the kids playing on the playground, and they said, these are the kids who are going to pay for your Social Security and your health care. How much education do you want them to have? I think people have to think about that.
Well, and
because
you would think most of those kids
only
have grandparents as well, who
Right.
you would think would be motivated to really think about this issue. Yeah. So, okay, why don't we open up the floor for questions? And I think we should have a mic in both aisles. So just raise your hand, and the mic will arrive to you.
Thank you very much for the session. My question is a little bit cheeky, but it's also very respectful and very sincere. Shouldn't we as Stanford be asking alumni to donate to Berkeley because we have enough and the UC system is broke? You know, at which point does the private sector also take responsibility in the field of education? Thank you.
think that's a question for you, John.
I don't think they'd believe it's a good investment of their money. No, I don't. I think it's an interesting question. Here's the thing I would say. I think the private institutions do have a moral obligation to try to expand the number of students they have and not leave that all to the public institutions, which was what we've done for a long time, because the public institutions are not getting the revenue that they need to do it. So we have an obligation, and I think we should try to do it, to try to provide more opportunities for young people. Somebody had a question over here?
In the abstract and also in your introduction, you mentioned two factors, poverty and race, but I don't think I heard race being mentioned specifically in all of the discussion of what that.
So Sean has data exactly on the race versus poverty issue, I think.
And then related to that, does family structure play an important role of two-parent families versus single-parent families, or what role, if you regress on that, does that play?
So on the race issue, so over the last 40 years or so, the achievement gap between high and low income students has grown by about 40%, and the racial achievement gaps have declined a little bit, actually. So the achievement gap between high and low income kids is a lot bigger now than the racial achievement gap. But that's not to say the racial achievement gap isn't still huge. In our data and in all the other national data, the achievement gap between the average black and the average white students is the equivalent of about 2 grade levels of achievement. That's very high. If I showed you this picture, that isn't there anymore, but if I sort of showed you the school districts,
There it is.
where all the majority of white students go to schools in the United States, it's sort of in the middle and upper right of the picture, and the majority of black students and Hispanic students go to schools that are sort of in the lower left part of this picture. And so there's the segregation, both, and the inequality by social class is a big contributor to those racial disparities, but it's not the only thing. So even when you look at school districts and communities where you have black and white families who have roughly equal income and parents have equal levels of education and the same number of two-parent families and all of that, you still on average see a racial achievement gap. And part of that is because black families live in worse neighborhoods, even in the same city, than equal income white families. So racial segregation leads to unequal neighborhoods and therefore sort of unequal schools. But also, there's a lot of evidence that there are sort of subtle and often not so subtle processes inside of schools that really don't allow minority students the same opportunities that white students have. And I don't think it'd be great if we eliminated the economic gaps between whites and blacks in the United States. That'd be huge progress and we would all applaud, but it's not clear that that alone would get us all the way to racial equality. There's a lot of kind of the interpersonal work and the kind of other structural forces that are still at play and unfortunately alive and well in America. So we have a lot of work to do on the race piece, and I don't mean by just showing this picture to sort of imply that we've checked off the race problem and let's move on to the economic problem. On the family structure thing, it's a mild predictor. It's nowhere near the magnitude of these other things. It's not the big story.
And if you look at Raj Chetty's data, which looks at economic outcome over a long period of time, while family structure is a force, segregation is a giant force, school quality is a giant force, community and the ability of the community to provide alternative support structures for young people all become big factors in terms of how well people do. And it's incredibly disparate across cities in the United States. Completely different outcomes for kids born into the same socioeconomic status in two different cities can have very different outcomes depending on the schools and segregation and all these other factors.
Well,
so.
Just think about kids in East Palo Alto, where we've worked with your help for many, many years. A lot of families don't have internet access. They don't have computers. If you go to the library, most of the library stuff has been evaporating also. You have to sign up to use the computer for 15 minutes because there's a line of people who need to use the computer to look for a job or whatever it is. That's how you're supposed to get your assignments done and so on. So all those other pieces, you know, just pile on to the inequality.
Yeah. Okay, let's get some.
So there's a lot of excitement when people talk about reforming schools, about, say, charter schools, or, you know, it's all the union's faults. You've been talking a lot about just if you spend smarter, if you spend in the right places, that we could largely fix the system. Like, can we do that without making major systemic changes? Can we just put more money in and spend it better?
Some people have done it. I mentioned some of the places where that's happened, and with, you know, substantial outcomes. Connecticut being one of those places, you know, Massachusetts in the 90s, which became one of the top achieving states. They put money in and spent it in some wise ways. So it takes enlightened leadership. It also takes coalitions of people who will work together, you know, over party lines and through different administrations and so on over a period of time. There are always barriers to doing that, to be sure. I don't know that the unions are the major barrier. There are, you know, things that need to evolve in collective bargaining agreements to allow innovation in schools, you know, that would break through some of the old traditional work rules. But if you look at the places that have made strong gains, you know, they've done it with unions as often as without.
Maybe we could eliminate tenure after 2 years.
You know, but let me talk about that for a minute. You know, at Stanford University, when we hire somebody, we have about 6 months to, there's sort of a little probationary period, and then you kind of have to make a decision.
A year now.
Is it a year now? Okay. So you have, it used to be 6 months, it's now a year. In the public schools, you have 2 years with no rights for the teacher to take a look at a teacher, see if they're competent, and you can let them go immediately. So that's twice as long as you have at Stanford University to make a judgment about whether somebody's competent. And if you can't tell an incompetent teacher, frankly, within about 6 weeks, then you're an incompetent administrator. So the issue is
well, but that incompetent administrator was once an incompetent teacher, probably.
That could be true. That could be true. I think, you know, whenever you, it's not, I don't think the issue is when do you do tenure decisions. Yes. You could do them at 2 years, you could do them at 1 year, you could do them at 3 years. We essentially do it at 1 year here. You know, do it at 2 years in the state law, it could be 3 years. The question is, do you have a good evaluation system in place and a good mentoring system? And unfortunately, what happens in dysfunctional school districts, where the administrators aren't getting around to see the teachers, aren't, you know, making a competent decision if they're not doing well to get rid of them in 2 years or get them enough help, is that they will pass them along. If you made tenure at 3 years, they just keep weak teachers a year longer if they don't have the systems in place to do the mentoring and the evaluation. Yeah. So the real issue is not the length of time to tenure, it's really the evaluation system.
How do you do the evaluation? Yeah. Okay, let's get another question over here.
Hey, my name is Gustavo, and I really believe that resources are out there. You know, like low-income people have the chance to like use something such as Khan Academy to go and learn, and you know, reach a lot of achievements. But the thing is that I think that it just takes a lot more energy. You know, the resources, like they just have to work a lot more to take advantage of those resources and find them. So I wanted to know if you have any insights on how we can spark that protagonism in you know, in children, if they're either born with that or not, or you know, what it takes to spark that.
Yeah, no, this is actually like our central question at Khan Academy right now is how, you know, there's some incredible work done right here at Stanford, Carol Dweck on growth mindset, and Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania on grit and resilience, and you know, their work shows that there are interventions you can do that make people realize that, you know, their intellect or their ability isn't fixed, And we've actually even done some collaborations with them where we've done these mini interventions with students and sometimes with teachers. And we've seen, with 50,000 students, within a day, you see, 5%, 10% more engagement. And those were these really quick little interventions. So that's actually one of our core areas of focus. And part of it is, can we make the system itself more engaging? Can we tie it? What I talked about, this PSAT, SAT, Khan Academy loop, and the PSAT could start as early as 8th grade. This could be a very powerful, a lot of these students don't realize the connection between that work that they could do on a Khan Academy or some other resource today and the implications that it could save them a year when they get to community college. It could save them they might not have to take a remedial class when they get to college, or they'll get to a better college, or they'll get a scholarship or whatever, a job. So if we can tie those dots a little bit closer. One project that I'm really excited about that you're going to start seeing on Khan, and this should be relevant to a lot of the students here as well, is we want to do a whole career portal. A lot of us in the room, we had a friend or a classmate or a classmate's parent or somebody who's like, oh, wow, that's an interesting career. Like, maybe I could pursue that. Okay, what do I need to do to pursue that? Or, okay, if I go to Stanford, then, okay, those recruiters are there and I can plug into that. And so we're going to try to do a kind of interviews with people, but really talk about what their stresses are, how hard it is to get where they got, how much they make, in as many career tracks as possible, some that require college education or graduate education, and some that don't, so that students, you can't be what you don't see. And so more students are going to have access to that. We're partnering with the Boys and Girls Club and other after-school programs. We just have the Chicago Public Schools, which is, most people, it has all sorts of problems with it and dysfunctional in a lot of ways, but we just culminated a challenge with them. It's called LearnStorm, where we got roughly 10% of the 3rd through 12th grade students in Chicago to engage on Khan Academy, and then we rewarded them for things like grit and perseverance, because we can see that in the data. There was no way to measure that before. How do you see that, what someone does in their bedroom in terms of do they stick with a question after they get it wrong? But now we can measure that. And so the more that we can, even David Coleman, the head of the College Board, we've had some interesting conversations about what could the future of the SAT be. There might always be a piece that measures, okay, can you solve this type of a math problem or reading comprehension? But maybe even more important, could we measure at least a proxy for resilience, which in a lot of ways will correlate much more with success than whether you can factor a polynomial.
So we haven't talked a lot about higher education, but one of the interesting factors is that grit resilience turns out to be a big factor for low-income kids surviving in college. And they have higher dropout rates and higher non-completion rates. But if you can measure it and really build it, it would be great. Okay, let's take another question.
This is a question from someone online.
Oh, an online question.
At what point should we hold school districts and teacher unions accountable for running the schools more efficiently?
Well, I guess if efficient means achieving better outcomes, I don't think it means necessarily cutting the budget, but achieving better outcomes without spending more money, that's a good question. Thoughts?
I mean, it's hard to measure how effective a school district is because kids, as I said earlier, kids' sort of educational success is not just the product of the time they spend in the classroom or in the school building. It's the product of all their sort of experiences. And so sort of isolating which school districts are particularly effective or particularly ineffective is, I think, a tricky thing to do. I mean, one thing you would like to see, of course, is that kids aren't sort of falling further and further behind the longer they're in school. That would sort of be an indicator of not success, right? So right. I think there are some ways you could get it, but it's a tricky thing from a sort of isolating the school's effect from what other things are going on in the rest of the kids' lives. So I don't think we have the tools yet to do that well.
We're embarking on a new a path around that, and we've just come out of the No Child Left Behind era, which was left behind in December of 2015, and we had many years of trying to hold districts accountable and schools accountable based on test scores and targets and sanctions if you didn't meet the targets for all of the different groups of kids in the school and so on, and that was much less successful than hoped for. The right. Good idea of trying to focus on everybody's learning was a good idea, but the methods were problematic. And on PISA, we went down in math, science, and reading during that period of time. It didn't produce the outcomes. But now there's a new law that will ask states to develop accountability systems using multiple measures. So they have to look at how are we doing on graduation rates? How are we doing not only in English and math, but on English learner proficiency gains? What are we doing about reducing suspensions or expulsions or exclusions of kids from school and other things? So California and other states are trying to figure out how to look at more things, how to be accountable for many of the things that might matter in the long run, how to create continuous improvement systems for districts and schools, because every year they have to set new goals, look at their data, figure out how to redesign the money and where it's going. So budgeting is now tied in with the accountability process. It's an interesting frame of reference. Much of it we can thank our good friend Mike Hurst for, who is the chair of the state board and a longtime Stanford professor, and others who've been working with him. I think we'll see, but it's better grounded in what we know about how organizations operate, learn, and change, and can become more effective than what we were doing before.
So, Linda, is there any merit to this idea that's been proposed by some people? If you take the really worst performing schools out of the mix, you actually get a significant improvement in overall accomplishment. Could you really, and now I'm not trying to grade every school, I'm trying to find the 10% of the schools that are really a problem.
Right.
Could you find a way of doing that and really go after that problem?
I think so. And I think that, and that's actually one of the things that's expected in the new laws, that you'll identify schools that are doing, poorly in various areas. Unlike the old law, which basically said you identify schools that are not succeeding and you tell them they have to do it.
Right.
This one actually says you have to look at the resources available. You have to equalize them if necessary. You have to have a diagnostic of all the parts of the school and what it's doing well, what it's doing badly, bring expertise in, bring learning opportunities. So there are very interesting things going on. In Shanghai, they pair low-performing schools and high-performing schools. They have some of the teachers and others from the high-performing schools go into the low-performing schools and work there for a while. The other ones go here and learn what the practices are. They have a contract. Some of the districts in California are doing that now as part of their accountability and getting very interesting results. So I think it's possible to, as long as you're not saying we're going to starve you and stomp on you as our strategy, I think it is possible.
That backfires, right?
Yeah, that didn't work so well.
No. All right, I think we can take a couple more questions before. Where are our mics?
One's over here.
Okay, there we go.
Thanks for coming. I had a quick question for Salman Khan. Dr. Hennessy, President Hennessy, you talked about how can we trust a system, guarantee success if we just invest more public money. I'm more curious about how do we trust the private industry? What are you doing with this data that we're getting? We're amassing terabytes and terabytes of data. How do we know that companies and private organizations that are VC funded aren't hoarding this data, black box systems where we don't actually know what kind of things? So if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing with your data, who you're sharing with it, and what goals you have in mind for that, I think that'd be really valuable.
Yeah, no, excellent question. And I mean, even in the early days in 2009, when I was kind of setting up Khan Academy as a formal organization, and it was, at least relative to now, a fairly small organization then, it was pretty clear that the data could be very valuable in terms of helping students, in terms of either personalizing for them or for seeing what resources are effective or not. But it could also be misused, if you somehow used to market to the students or to kind of put them into buckets in kind of non-constructive ways. That was one of the main reasons why we set up as a not-for-profit organization. So, every resource we have is in service of our mission. And a big part of, and being not-for-profit isn't enough. You also have to make sure that you establish trust with your users. Otherwise, they frankly shouldn't use you. And so we don't share the data with anyone. You go to Khan Academy, you'll see 0 ads, 0 marketing. That is not part of, somehow how we see ourselves funding ourselves, and that will always be the case. And yeah, it's all, in conversations with the College Board, even there, it has to be student permission. They have to be well aware of what it's going to be. But then we have a a responsibility on our side that the data has to be in service of the student. It has to be about personalizing it for them, or it has to be about improving the resources or testing the efficacy of the system. But yeah, I think, you know, the legislation is behind the reality of where things are right now. So you know, there is a bit of this, you know, boom in ed tech, and I have the same concern as you do about how is some of that data eventually going to get used. It's very easy when you come out the gate to have kind of an altruistic, broader mission. We want to, but you know, when the funding starts to dry up, when you have to pay the rent in a certain way, and your bottom line is profit, it might make people make some strange decisions.
Yeah, probably right. Okay, one last question, and then we'll let everybody. We're over time already.
Hi, thanks for a great night. Anytime you have an effective technology, if it's not equally accessible to everyone, you can actually create a bigger achievement gap. So in other words, if all your middle income and upper income kids are using Khan Academy, the achievement gap will widen. So do you know what % of the users on the Khan Academy are low income kids, and how are you trying to make sure that that continues to narrow?
Yeah, you know, what we've seen is interesting. Before the partnership with the College Board, we could intuit a little bit by trying to figure out what zip codes people are coming from and things like that. But we actually didn't know, we didn't have a lot of information. You know, just anecdotally, we did see that we had higher penetration in places like the Bay Area, on the coasts. And, but, you know, when we ran this LearnStorm pilot in the Bay Area last year, where we had about 80,000 students in the Bay Area participate, 50% of those students came from majority free and reduced lunch schools. The district, the large district that had the most grit and had the most engagement was actually Oakland. So that was really promising. You know, when this SAT partnership, this was a core issue. It's like, okay, we can make it free, but if it's dependent on access to a computer, which it is, well, right now, 30% of Americans don't have broadband and computers at home, and those are the 30% who are on, you know, that side of the of that chart. And so, are we going to make it worse? And so that was a big part of it, and this came from the College Board, is to partner with Boys and Girls Club is the big partner here, but to partner with a lot of districts, after-school programs, figure out ways for students to have access. And what's been you know, made us feel good is this last administration of the SAT. This was the first administration that was using these tools. They surveyed the students, and it was 60% of students used the resources, and that usage was actually pretty broad across, pretty equal across ethnic and income brackets. And I suspect right now there is a bit of higher penetration amongst, I don't know if it's income, but for sure families that have access to the internet or have parents who have a college education. That probably is there, and that's why so much of our focus right now is, you know, how do we do these challenges with districts and you know, school systems, Boys and Girls Clubs, things like that, to make it more level.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting historical perspective here, because the College Board was originally created, the SAT was created to try to get greater equity and greater meritocracy in the system. And then over time, as inequality grew in the United States, it actually became something that preserved inequality and created inequality, and now I think it's great. The College Board is trying to grapple with this problem. How do we make sure that every child in the United States gets a chance to have an SAT prep course, not just those from the upper income levels? And I think it gets back to what Sean said. I think we're finally coming to grips with the fact that inequality may be the biggest challenge we face domestically in our country, and we've got to address it, and it's for the good of our children and our grandchildren. Let me ask you all to thank our terrific panelists for joining us tonight.